Dear friends, this is an unabridged version of a lecture that I gave on Zoom at the Front Range Anthroposophical Café on June 27th, 2025. In this video, I included material that I had to remove for the cafe audience due to time restrictions. This is the complete lecture. I did include chapter markers, however, if you want to skim or jump around. I'll talk about a tiny book that I'm sure many of you, if you're interested in Rudolf Steiner's Anthroposophy, and that I'm sure many of you have studied or even performed in various versions. That would be Goethe's fairy tale of the green snake and beautiful lily. One can argue that in a karmic sense, this little art fairy tale by Goethe is the reason that we have Rudolf Steiner's Anthroposophy in the world today. You may find that statement questionable or even silly, but the meaning comes directly from Rudolf Steiner. Of course, one can disagree with Rudolf Steiner and say that there are other germinal seeds that sprouted more decisively and importantly, or that there were spiritual friendships that were far more significant, such as Rudolf Steiner's meeting with Marie von Sievers. But from a literary perspective, I do agree with the doctor. If we want to explore the literary development of Rudolf Steiner's Anthroposophy or learn to read Rudolf Steiner's Anthroposophy as literature, well then, Goethe's little fairy tale is a foundational text and a very good place to start. Now, you will notice that I chose as a title for this talk a phrase from a famous modernist poem by T.S. Eliot, "In my end is my beginning." But don't worry, I'm not going to bring T.S. Eliot into the lecture tonight. The poem that he wrote begins with a reversal of the title phrase for my talk. I said, "In my end is my beginning," but if you know the poem East Coker from the Four Quartets, Eliot starts out the poem by saying, "In my beginning is my end." In my beginning is my end. In succession, houses rise and fall. But by the time we arrive at the end of this long, beautiful poem, the opening proposition, "In my beginning is my end," has done a flip-flop, or an inversion, or as the Germans might say, an Umstülpung, much like that famous snake that bites and swallows its own tail, or the yin that becomes yang, and thus, presto changeo, we arrive at the proposition, "In my end is my beginning." I'll read this ending for all us oldsters out there who will sooner or later be youngsters again. Old men ought to be explorers. Here or there does not matter. We must be still and still moving into another intensity for a further union, a deeper communion through the dark, cold, and empty desolation, the wave cry, the wind cry, the vast waters of the petrel and the porpoise. In my end is my beginning. Now, all those lines sound very prophetic and even biblical, but another way to invoke what is said here, "In my beginning is my end, in my end is my beginning," another way to invoke that sentiment is to conjure with an old, magical, idealist Rosicrucian formula that goes like this. Once upon a time, when did it happen? When did it not happen? And so we come back to that germinal seed, the fairy tale, where yin becomes yang and yang becomes yin, and when it's all finished, we start off again. And so let's do that. Dear friends, isn't it interesting that so many of Rudolf Steiner's lectures began with this greeting, "Dear friends"? When you think about the thousands of lectures that Rudolf Steiner gave and how often he began those lectures by speaking the simple greeting, "Dear friends," well, I don't know about you, but for me, that phrase, "Dear friends," almost begins to sound like a mantra, or maybe a prayer. Just as those simple words, "dear friends," are easily heard and easily forgotten as we lose ourselves in the twisting labyrinth of Rudolf Steiner's many lectures, so, too, it is easy to miss a very important and obvious aspect of Goethe's fairy tale, namely, that this is a tale about friendship and about the power of spiritual friendship. Now, people have racked their brains over this fairy tale to discover its deeper hidden meanings, and they have found quite a few, when, in fact, Goethe wrote this fairy tale under the inspiration of his friendship for Friedrich Schiller. And friendship, one might very well argue, is the magical key that unlocks the truly esoteric meaning at the heart of the fairy tale and brings it to life. Here's a famous fragment by Novalis that makes the same point, and I'm sure you all know it. The fairy tale appears as the final story in a collection of stories called, in English, Conversations of German Refugees. This is a novella in which a group of refugees who are fleeing military aggression and chaotic times try to strengthen bonds of friendship and social harmony by telling themselves stories every night. Goethe patterned this book on a famous book called the Decameron by the Renaissance poet Boccaccio. In the Decameron, a small group of refugees self-isolate and try to remain friendly and happy in the face of what for them is a global pandemic catastrophe, the Black Death. In Goethe's book, we have a similar situation, but the catastrophe is called the French Revolution and its social, cultural, political aftermath in Europe. In this novella by Goethe, stories are told, as I said, to encourage friendship, conversation, distraction, and feelings of safety and happiness during a time of social upheaval. And the so-called fairy tale is the last story that is told. Now, when I talk about Goethe's fairy tale to an audience of anthroposophists, I can always assume that they know the tale quite well, so I will not digress to summarize it now as I would do if I were in a college classroom, for example. But if you have not read the fairy tale by Goethe, there are many translations out there, free and otherwise, including my own translation, which I do recommend. And I've also recently made a recording of that translation, if that helps you. It's important to keep in mind that Rudolf Steiner received this fairy tale from a spiritual friend. A professor of literature who was Rudolf Steiner's mentor and spiritual guide gave his young student Rudolf a copy as a birthday present. And oh, by the way, the professor is the guy with the serious beard, not the friendly-looking woman who sits there in front of the impressive bookcase with an open book in front of her as though she were lecturing. She is the professor's wife, and she also knew Rudolf Steiner. In a Waldorf school classroom, teachers call such a mysterious gift, such as the fairy tale that the professor gave young Rudolf Steiner, his pupil. They call this kind of gift a pedagogical story that is meant to inspire or awaken a young student's latent talent or some part of the student's personality that is yet undeveloped or perhaps even unsuspected by the student herself. Often such a story is not fully understood when it is first received. But if the story is really the right pedagogical story, it will work homeopathically and seed-like over time, even during sleep, especially during sleep. And sometimes such a seed story takes years to reveal its decisive meanings. And that's how it was for Rudolf Steiner with the fairy tale, as Rudolf Steiner told us. And that's what Goethe wanted his fairy tale to do. When Goethe wrote the fairy tale, he and Friedrich Schiller had just become friends. Their friendship inspired each of them, and because of that friendship, the movement known as Weimar Classicism was born. The term Weimar Classicism refers to that golden age of German literature when Goethe, Schiller, and other very famous literary types in Central Europe were active. This is the literary period at the end of the 18th century and very early 19th century that inspired Rudolf Steiner and set the course for his life. It's a moment of literary brilliance that coincides with German early Romanticism. In a literary sense, this is the source spring for Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy. There's no doubt that Rudolf Steiner's literature professor and mentor and spiritual friend, there's no doubt that this person had a decisive impact on young Rudolf Steiner. We know this directly from Rudolf Steiner himself. The professor, like a wise Waldorf teacher, opened a door and showed his young student a brave new land. It was a decisive karmic moment, as Rudolf Steiner said. Quote, "When I went to call at Schröer's little library, which was also his study, I felt that I was in a spiritual atmosphere in the highest degree beneficial to my inner life." And in a letter written from this period in Vienna, 1881, Rudolf Steiner confessed, "I thank God and a fortunate destiny that I have become acquainted with a man here in Vienna, a person who, with the exception of Goethe, naturally, may be counted as the most knowledgeable on Faust, a man whom I must revere as a teacher, scholar, poet, and human being." A footnote. Now, if you're interested in this line of literary research, I can recommend the essay by Emil Bock that I posted on the North American section website. It will provide some very helpful context. I mentioned spiritual friendship as the controlling theme for this talk tonight, and I did that partly because Goethe gave us very directly an important clue about the symbol of the snake in respect to our theme of spiritual friendship in his fairy tale. In a letter written to a friend in 1814, Goethe wrote, quote, "As a symbol of eternity, the snake that closes on itself as a circle, recommends itself to our attention. I like to view this as a symbol of a fortunate earthly life. What more can a human being desire but that it be granted him to connect the beginning with the end? And how may this occur but through the continuance of affection, trust, love, and friendship? Now, my friends, it is certainly possible to read the Ouroboros as an alchemical symbol. But first, I think we need to read the Ouroboros in the direct way that Goethe had in mind. This is especially important when we read Goethe's fairy tale as the germinal seed for the anthroposophical movement, I would argue. And why do I say that? Well, one of the characteristics of Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy is how many different types of people it attracts. In many respects, anthroposophy is a social enigma and a brilliant social challenge, and that is just what Goethe's fairy tale is all about. Rudolf Steiner had the ability, when he was alive, to bring together people who otherwise might very well have avoided one another, who even disliked one another, or who simply never would have bumped into one another if their lives had gone otherwise. The karmic reality is that if these varied persons had not found common ground in a story known as anthroposophy, well, they probably would not have crossed paths. And as we know, students of Rudolf Steiner have a pretty good historical track record of fighting with one another and hiding the cheese and not getting along, sometimes tragically. Quite dramatically, we witnessed two disasters at the end of Rudolf Steiner's life. The first disaster is the burning of the original Goetheanum on New Year's Eve, 1923. Rudolf Steiner remarked that one spiritual reason for this disaster was the inability of the quarreling members of the anthroposophical societies to overcome and renounce their individual differences and ego ambitions and unite for the greater good of the community in spiritual friendship. The second disaster, of course, and perhaps even a greater disaster in fact, is the self-destruction of the General Anthroposophical Society that Rudolf Steiner founded at the Christmas conference, a deed celebrated in a cold and crowded carpentry shack overlooking the ruins of the first Goetheanum. The Christmas conference inspired everyone, but a short time afterwards, almost immediately after Rudolf Steiner's death in 1925, his pupils started to fight and bicker and stab one another in the back and to behave as we human beings generally behave when we decide not to practice spiritual friendship. Now, they were all under stress, of course, and those were difficult times. But, I don't know, aren't we all under stress most of the time? And aren't we always complaining that these are difficult times? And now that we have passed the 100-year anniversary of Rudolf Steiner's death, we find ourselves approaching the 100-year anniversary of that difficult, very difficult period in the history of anthroposophy. What have we learned? And here is where we come back to Goethe's little fairy tale and fairy tales generally. Rudolf Steiner told us that, in a certain sense, everyone who is awakened by anthroposophia is a refugee. I like to keep this in mind. Rudolf Steiner spoke about this refugee phenomenon of the homeless modern soul many times. He said that the soul condition of a modern human being who finds his way to anthroposophia resembles the soul condition of a homeless person, a refugee. Now that is to say, someone who has fallen out of the world and finds him or herself isolated, all alone, confused, and under great stress. That rings true to me. But in my experience, that's just a starting point. The suffering that a homeless soul experiences as a refugee from a lost spirit homeland, as Novalis called it, this experience of suffering is a seed point of great potential. It is potentially an ending and a beginning. When a refugee, so-called, hears a story about a being called Anthroposophia, so Rudolf Steiner has told us, then something potentially awakens inside. Something is born. You might say, like Plato said, that the soul remembers something of its true spirit nature. Who am I? And as I said, Novalis called this something that awakens inside the soul, a memory of home. Plato and other poets talk about this awakening of spirit remembrance, but Plato didn't talk about anthroposophia. Plato talked about beauty. You can read what Plato said about beauty in the dialogue called Phaedrus, for example. Phaedrus is a kind of fairy tale, one might well argue, in which an old dude and a young dude have a friendly spiritual conversation about beauty and the human being, and how beauty helps the human being to remember who am I and awaken to the spirit. And once again, this brings us full circle to Goethe's fairy tale and its theme of spiritual friendship. Spiritual friendship is the critical quality of soul that nourishes and inspires a healthy community of individuals. Spiritual friendship is an ideal that Rudolf Steiner aspired to his entire life, and his aspiration for that ideal culminated in the first Goetheanum and in the Christmas Foundation conference after that first Goetheanum burned to the ground. But the question arises, what quality or being nourishes spiritual friendship? Well, there are various answers, of course, but Goethe's fairy tale, like Plato's fairy tale, tells us that a very important quality or being that nourishes spiritual friendship and healthy community is beauty. Christiana Hyde, our section leader, discussed this at our recent section conferences in San Francisco in 2024 and quite recently in 2025. She did not talk about Goethe's fairy tale specifically, although she did mention Plato, and she discussed why beauty was so important to Rudolf Steiner and why beauty is so important to the anthroposophical movement and to our section, whose name in German is the Section for the Beautiful Sciences, as you know. You can read Christiana's keynote lecture on beauty in this little book that I prepared especially for the two conferences, or, if you like, you can find her remarks in a shortened version on the section website. Christiana talked about beauty in her relationship, that is to say, beauty's relationship, to beauty's two sisters, truth and goodness. And indeed, the mystery of beauty and beauty's role in nurturing spiritual friendship and community is allied very closely to the influences and workings of her two other equally mysterious sisters, truth and goodness. You can investigate that on the section website if you like, but here I only want to focus on beauty. The mystery of beauty is the key to healthy spiritual friendship, Goethe and Plato argue, and it is perhaps even the key to the practice of spirit remembrance, as Plato suggested. Does Rudolf Steiner agree? I think he does. Here's a statement by Rudolf Steiner that Christiana highlighted in her recent talk at the North American Section Conference. The connection with the spirit breaks if it is not maintained by beauty. Beauty binds the eye to the body. This is a jotting from one of Rudolf Steiner's notebooks. It was written in 1918, and this jotting by Rudolf Steiner speaks directly to the theme that we find in Goethe's fairy tale, and it helps us understand why Rudolf Steiner saw the fairy tale by Goethe as a germinal seed. When Goethe wrote his fairy tale for Schiller, he and his best friend Schiller, and many others like them, were very upset about how the world was falling apart, as I remarked. All the old cultural and social certainties were crumbling. All the old stories had had their day. Poets were complaining, "We need a new mythology." Science had thrown religion on the trash heap. Scientistic capitalism and nationalism, these were fast becoming all the rage. Egotism was celebrated. Spirit had become a mere emergent property of matter, a mere fairy tale, if you like. Modernity was perceived as a looming threat. When Goethe and Schiller looked at the social and political and cultural chaos of their time from the perspective of their little pond known as Central Europe in the aftermath of the French Revolution, they each felt very disquieted, as did many others. And when Goethe and Schiller looked at the world and its problems, they, each in a different way, came home to the mystery of beauty, as I said, in their own ways. Schiller wrote a book of serious philosophy, or what we now call critical theory, with the weighty title Letters Concerning the Aesthetic Education of the Human Being. And he wrote this to help himself and others understand what this mystery of beauty was all about, and how beauty saves the world. Now, keep an eye on the website, because I plan to post a video on that book by Schiller, which, as Rudolf Steiner rightly recognized, is a companion to Goethe's fairy tale. But Goethe, who thought that philosophy was not as helpful as poetry, Goethe wrote a fairy tale to explain what Schiller had explicated philosophically, and to poke fun at his friend Schiller, because he thought that Schiller spent too much time cracking his head over German philosophy, and he thought that the fairy tale and poetry were mightier than philosophy and did a better job. Several decades later, a brainy, young, and overachieving science and math student from a humble background, who likewise spent all his spare hours cracking his head over German philosophy, hint, I'm talking about Rudolf Steiner. Several decades later, after Goethe wrote his fairy tale, this brilliant young student, Rudolf Steiner, received Goethe's story about the mystery of beauty from a spiritual friend and mentor. Thus the ripples go out. And here we are, and here we arrive at our question of the hour. Does the mystery of beauty really hold such germinal seed potential as Rudolf Steiner claimed? How is that possible? I'm showing you again that notebook jotting by Rudolf Steiner that we used in the section as a leading thought at our recent North American section conferences. If you play with that leading thought for a moment, I is the name that we give to a spirit activity that shapes and organizes human soul forces of thinking, feeling, and willing, according to Rudolf Steiner. That being so, Rudolf Steiner appears to be suggesting that unless the being of beauty can weave its mysteriously binding connections between the world of spirit and the world that we find at hand, unless beauty can do this, then the I cannot establish a friendly relationship with the physical body or the world at hand. We lose a balanced sense of embodiedness and relatedness to self and other. We lose a capacity for spiritual friendship with oneself, and consequently, friendship with others. Rudolf Steiner called this a soul condition of homelessness. In this friendless, unhappy soul condition, we have lost a sense of relatedness and belonging. We are refugees. And whether this death-in-life endpoint becomes a germinal seed for a new beginning, well, this would seem to depend on the mystery and being of beauty, Rudolf Steiner suggests. But, my friends, in this reading, beauty is not a mere adornment to dress up the world at hand with a smiley face that deceives us into thinking that all is okay when common sense and unpoetical observation tell us that no, all is certainly not okay. Beauty is not a smiley face, says Rudolf Steiner, as he explained many times, right at the beginning of things, actually. Beauty is not a mere distraction from the seriously playful inner work that is required if we want to practice spirit remembrance. Beauty is not a narcotic. From the perspective of spiritual science, beauty is an enlivening being or spirit power that can act upon the human being and thus transform self and world in a truly magical, idealist way. But whether beauty can act in this enlivening way depends on the free and creative activity of the I. Put another way, it depends on the discovery and use of what in our section work we call poetic intelligence. Poetic intelligence is another way to talk about that realm of spiritual freedom and activity that Rudolf Steiner characterized in so many multiple ways, and which Goethe and Schiller and Novalis celebrated in the many writings that inspired the young Rudolf Steiner and set him off on his search for Anthroposophia once upon a time as a young man. And I will tell you, my friends, quite frankly, and I will state this as my thesis here at the end of my talk, that in my opinion, beauty is the guiding spirit for all our section work and research. That is why the fairy tale by Goethe is such a foundational text. That is also why, in my opinion, that when Rudolf Steiner created our section, which is called in English the Section for the Literary Arts and Humanities, but which in German is called the Section for the Beautiful Sciences, that is why when Rudolf Steiner created our section at the Christmas conference, he said that the beautiful sciences had been neglected, much to the detriment of civilization. But just to be clear, Rudolf Steiner was not talking about a science of aesthetics when he used the old-fashioned name beautiful sciences, although I should point out our section does include aesthetics. We are a big tent. Rudolf Steiner, like Goethe, like Schiller, like Novalis, like William Blake, William Wordsworth, Emily Dickinson, like Plato, like many other poets, Rudolf Steiner was talking about the being and mystery of beauty, beauty herself. And if beauty is the presiding goddess for the section for the beautiful sciences, what does this mean for the cultivation of poetic intelligence as a methodology for our section work? And what is poetic intelligence? And how does beauty foster it? And finally, what is the role of goodness in respect to this mystery of beauty? Do beauty and goodness, in an interweaving lemniscate, perhaps have a paired ability to strengthen discernment and equanimity? And in that sense, do they make possible a community, or sangha, if you like, that allows truth to become unconcealed? Here is a familiar verse by Rudolf Steiner that relates very directly to my theme and to Goethe's fairy tale. Why is it that the green snake, who performs her community-forming deed when the time is at hand, becomes the celebrated heroine of the tale? What does the green snake's gesture of spiritual friendship and renunciation tell us about the possible future destiny of the anthroposophical movement as we enter this second quarter of our 21st century, more than 100 years after Rudolf Steiner's death? And finally, is the fairy tale mightier than philosophy? Thank you for your attention and for your interest in Romanticism and for your interest in the section for the literary arts and humanities. Good night.